Thank you so much. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. Thanks to all the brave souls who managed to make it here today. Well done to all of you. I know we've got a lot of people who simply could not make it because a couple of inches of snow puts everything to a standstill for some strange reason. But thanks so much, everyone, for coming down. My name is Azim Ibrahim. I'm one of the senior directors here at the New Lines Institute. For those who are not aware, the New Lines Institute is a non-partisan foreign policy think tank based here in Washington, with operations also in London and Brussels. We focus specifically on the intersection of US foreign policy and global geopolitics. And we have a number of different kind of projects and portfolios. You can see a lot of the material around you, where we have projects on mass atrocities, international law. We have a project on transnational repression, which we're just launching. The Balkans Observatory, which is obviously this one, and the projects on gender, straight fragility, and there's a whole wide variety of different kind of work that we do. And specifically, we're a small boutique think tank where we focus very heavily on what policymakers are actually looking for and try to get ahead of the curve and try to focus on more getting our material to key policymakers and having an impact. So today, thanks so much for coming to this event on the Western Balkans Observatory. This is an initiative that was set up by the New Lines Institute to provide rigorous, non-partisan analysis for policymakers on the Western Balkans and what's happening there, looking at emerging challenges and crises in the region through essays, events, roundtables, and we recently published a multi-author report looking at the most pertinent issues that are facing the Western Balkans, and there's copies of the report for you to take away here with you. The key thing we are trying to do is filling in a gap. I think there is now a general consensus in Washington that they took their eye off the Western Balkans. They took their eye off what was happening there and the powder keg that has become, and they're now trying to play catch up. And so this is where we come in and we try to basically fill in that gap. And so today we're having this event on the Western Balkans in the next decades, looking at politics, security, and regional cooperation. We'll try to discuss the internal challenges of the security challenges, politics, and geopolitical pressures that are coming out with the region. So we have put together a stellar panel for you. One of our speakers is just on his way at the moment, but we have here on my immediate left and your right is Professor Tanya Domi, who is actually a senior non-resident fellow at the New Lines Institute and is the one that's actually the chief coordinator for the Western Balkans project. She's a professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs as an affiliate faculty member at the Harriman Institute, where she taught on the Balkan Studies program since 2008. Prior to this, she was a congressional aide. She also served in the US Army for 15 years and worked as a congressional aide and military policy advisor to the late Congressman Frank McCloskey. So if any of you are aware of the Balkans and what happened there, Frank McCloskey was obviously one of the very rare people that emerged with this reputation fully intact, the late Frank McCloskey. So Tanya played a critical role in that process. We also have Dr. Yasmin Vujanovic. He's a political scientist and policy specialist of Southeast European and International Affairs and has a PhD from York University in Toronto. He is the author of two brilliant books. The first is Hunger and Fury, The Crisis of Democracy in the Balkans, and the other one, which has just come out, is Bosniaks, Nationhood After Genocide, both of them published by Hearst and Oxford University Press. He's got an extensive background in global academia and professional engagement and has worked as a scholar, policy analyst, and consultant in North America and Europe. Our final attendee who's on his way is Dr. Harun Karcic, who's executive producer at Al Jazeera's Balkan Language Channel and co-founder of the Sarajevo Security Conference. The first inaugural event was just last year in Sarajevo, which was a huge success, which I also, and myself and Yasmin, also attended. And then fortunately, we had the other panelist, Dr. Ivana Stradler, could not join us today, but I'm sure she's going to be watching this online. And so with that, I'll pass it on to my panelists. I want to start off with yourself, Tanya. First of all, if you could just possibly give us a very brief kind of overview of what is happening in the Balkans and why should anybody care? When people turn on the TVs today, they obviously see a lot of stuff on the Middle East. They hear about the Balkans very scatterly. They hear about Kosovo, they hear about something called Dodic, about Serbia, and something in Bosnia. Elections are being disputed. There's some questions over the election efficacy, etc. But if you could just give us a very kind of quick overview of what's happening and why should anybody care?
Well, thank you so much, and it's really wonderful to be here with you and with Yasmin. Yasmin and I have known each other a really long time and done a lot of work together, and this is wonderful to be here together in Washington on this initiative. I'm not going to go into deep details on the politics because I know Yasmin's going to discuss that. But what I think right now is probably the most critical issue facing the Western Balkans is one of the security posture. And that is the war in Ukraine that began in 2022 has cast a long shadow on the region and giving impetus to the rise of Russia, more so in a way that is quite dangerous because it also has given impetus to Russian proxies. And that is very problematic internally to Bosnia, externally in Serbia, and moreover, as close as Zagreb, an EU member, and Mr. Orban on the border in Hungary. And so these actors are quite negative in the Balkans. The problem that we're dealing with is that weak foreign policy by the United States and moreover by the EU. And I would argue, and I know many of us agree about this, that it's a policy that seems to mollify some of the worst nationalist impulses, and it is inconsistent with US values. We say we believe in the rule of law, we say that we believe in democracy, but we don't act accordingly. And that has left people very desperate, people feeling very negative. And as a matter of fact, I would argue that the United States, and probably to a lesser extent the EU, because they've always been pretty weak, has left people with a lost respect. They have lost tremendous respect for the United States in that regard. So these ambitions from the East doesn't seem to have really woken up Western powers. And nonetheless, there's increasing violence. The attack in Kosovo in September, and of course, the continued calls for secession by Milorad Dodik, the Republika Srpska president, has led to, as recently as the January 9th, that initiated a bilateral movement by the United States to do a F-16 flyover. Nice, that's nice, it's a good response, but the problem is not going to be solved in the air over Bosnia. The problem is the diplomacy on the ground and the lack of support for where do we go here? How do we pursue democracy? How do we enforce the rule of law? And we also actually now have a high representative in the Dayton construct that supervises civilian aspects of law in Bosnia, who has essentially collaborated with Zagreb and the HDZ Croats against the sovereignty and more likely undermining the electoral process in Bosnia and Herzegovina with the full backing of the United States. So to this effect, we have a lot of despair. I share the despair. I question what are the strategic objectives here, And secondly, the security posture issue is not only a threat to Kosovo, despite the fact that they have a NATO reinforced presence. I would argue that the attack on Kosovo probably gives more impetus to their claims to enter NATO as soon as possible. And I would also argue the continued attacks within Bosnia on its sovereignty and the fact that the United States doesn't fly over or they put a ship on the shore of Bosnia when Dodik acts out should send a message to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly that it's time that Bosnia joins NATO too. So I'm just going to leave my comments there.
Thank you so much for that very good overview, Tanya. And so, Yasmin, staying on the same topic, Tanya mentioned about Dodik, the leader of Republic Srpska, who's essentially calling for independence of Bosnia's autonomous republic. And he's actually currently on trial for defying an international ruling, an international peace envoy. How did this situation evolve to such an extent? The whole purpose of the Dayton Agreement was to bring peace and stability to the region. And I know, your most recent book, you talk about this in your preface. And so how did the situation manage to evolve to such an extent that we have, the potential breakup of what was a flagship policy of the United States?
So, first of all, thanks for having me here. And it's I think that question is quite apropos this panel because, as I think Tanya and Azim both know, there's not a lot of attention in this town, unfortunately, for the Western Balkans. And I think that goes to the heart of many of the issues that Tanya has already raised, and goes to the heart of what you just asked, which is that, if you go back to the 1990s and into the 2000s, there's a generation of American policymakers who cut their teeth in the Western Balkans. And Dayton was this kind of apex achievement of that sort of Pax Americana moment, where it seems like the US can do virtually anything if it puts its mind to it after the end of the Cold War. And so Dayton has this really bizarre kind of double face. On the one hand, it's arguably, without question, perhaps the most successful peace agreement in modern history, especially given the scale of the violence in Bosnia, the scale of the atrocities. Dayton is signed and the fighting pretty much stops in a dot. It's the kind of thing we would all hope for with Israel and Palestine and Ukraine and all the other sort of conflicts that we're dealing with at this point. But Dayton also has this other really unique distinction, which is that, to my mind, as far as I know, it's the only peace agreement, at least in contemporary history, which has embedded into it a constitution. And so Bosnia's constitution is Annex 4 of the Dayton Agreement, and as you all know, it's this exceedingly complex document that, if you talk to the people who are still alive and kicking and active in American politics and policy, who are some of the primary architects of this document, they will tell you Dayton and the Dayton Constitution was never designed to see its 30th birthday. It was an armistice, right? This was not a constitution that was going to bring the country into, shall we say, modern European history. And unfortunately, for a series of very complex reasons, the United States stepped away from its enforcement role. The European Union could not fill that vacuum and often chose not to fill that vacuum. And you had a very, very rapid process of downloading authorities to local leaders at a time when most of these people were still not even really one full step removed from being warlords. So when you think about a guy like Milorad Dodik, who has this bizarre brief moment in the late 1990s as a darling of American foreign policy, Madeleine Albright famously refers to him as a breath of fresh air, he spent some time hanging out on American aircraft carriers, and seems like he's going to be the new sort of face of Bosnian Serb politics. By the time we get to the middle of the 2000s, Dodik like a lot of other folks in Bosnia, figures out that the incentives of the system as it is designed in Bosnia are not in cooperation, they're in conflict. And the system is such that very, very small electorates can sway the political system towards extremely destructive ends. I mean, I frequently point out to people, we talk about a guy like Milorad Dodik who goes and meets with Putin, 62 times a year, and meets with Alexander Vučić, and he has all this pomposity, and he has a massive desk in East Sarajevo that looks like it was designed to North Korea. He's this character, and you think, my God, what is the electoral base of this man? Surely he has some enormous structure. It's 300,000 people, right? He would be. He probably couldn't win the mayoralty of the city of Dayton, Ohio, right? And so this is the thing. These are small characters. These are small individuals, but because governance in Bosnia is so hamstrung by the dysfunction of the Dayton Agreement, it's been very, very difficult both for local actors to confront Dodik and also his partners in the Croat nationalist HDC, but then also Dayton has created all of these avenues for malign foreign interference. Tanya has talked about Hungary, but obviously the two big ones for Bosnia are Croatia and Serbia. And it's hugely problematic that at this juncture we have two states in the EU now that are really very, very actively undermining Bosnia's security and sovereignty, Hungary and Croatia. Both are NATO states as well. And the sort of the last thing that I would say vis-a-vis this before we sort of start getting a little bit more into the weeds is, if you want to quickly zoom out, from the specificity of Dayton, and you want to zoom out of Bosnia, David Cameron, the UK foreign minister, had a remarkably insightful line just about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago when he had he was at a hearing in the Commons, and he was asked about the UK's posture towards the Western Balkans, and he observed, he said, the problem with the West's general posture towards the Western Balkans is that we in the West are stuck in a pre-February 2022 moment. And he's absolutely right, because as we'll talk about in greater detail, the sort of the key thing over the last year, 2 years that's really gone wrong in the Western Balkans is that, as David Cameron observed, all the things that we're doing vis-a-vis Ukraine, all the things that we're doing, even vis-a-vis Taiwan, the things that we're sort of trying to do with our general geostrategic posture towards our adversaries in Beijing, in Moscow, we're not pursuing that in the Western Balkans. In fact, we're doing the exact opposite. As Tanya noted, we are actively propping up known Russian and Chinese assets. And that, I think, is a major, not just contradiction, but it's a major issue for the credibility, but also immediate security interests of the United States, but also the Atlantic community more broadly. Hi, Harvey.
Hello. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for joining us.
I'm so sorry. We are meeting at other side of the town, so
no, I understand everybody's at the mercy of the weather. So no, thanks so much for that, Yasmin. And I remember even at the Sarajevo Security Conference where I spoke, I gave an anecdote of I knew two people that worked with Richard Holbrooke, and one of them was British, the other one was American, very close advisors. And both of them told me that the biggest obstacle to actually modifying Dayton has always been Holbrooke. And Dayton was exactly as you said, it was designed to be a peace settlement to stop the war. It was not designed to be a permanent solution that never changes. It was simply designed as a function to stop the war, and then let's re-examine the situation. But the biggest obstacle was Holbrooke, because everywhere he went, he used this as a calling card, that I'm the one that brought peace to the Balkans. And anytime somebody wanted to modify it and say, well, look, it's kind of outlived its usefulness, he would always intervene. So he went to Afghanistan, he went to look at Dayton, it's still there. I'm the one that did this, and I'm the best person now to negotiate with Afghanistan and elsewhere. And the hope was, after he passed, that efforts will be in place to then review it and update it. But unfortunately, by that time, the interest, the attention of the United States has simply shifted elsewhere. I want to stay on the topic of, you mentioned, Yasmin, how the biggest, two of the spoilers in Europe, and are, Hungary and Croatia, obstacles to much of what's going on in the region. So Bosnia has obviously got aspirations to join NATO, and there is a process in place at the moment. How likely do you think that is in terms of with you've got two NATO members that are some of the two of the biggest obstacles?
So I don't know if this is going to be considered breaking news. I think it will be public shortly. But so Bosnia, as of this moment, still officially does not have a ambassador to NATO. And the reason why we don't have an ambassador to NATO is because Croatia has been holding up the designated ambassador. That's extraordinarily malign, given everything that's happening in Bosnia and given everything that's happening in the region, and also extraordinary given what the Plenković government in Zagreb professes to be its sort of official posture. We also had Secretary Blinken, a letter that he wrote on January 11th to the Bosnian foreign minister concerning a very important gas pipeline project in Bosnia that is designed and sponsored by the EU, but also indirectly the United States, that is designed to essentially wean Bosnia off of Russian gas. And who are the people who have been blocking it and obstructing it? It is the Croat nationalist HDZ, the proxy of the sister party of Andrej Plenković's HDZ in Zagreb. So this results in Tony Blinken having to write this letter, an extraordinary letter actually, in which he by name calls out Dragan Čović, the leader of the HDZ, calls him corrupt, self-serving. So Mr. Čović is probably cruising for sanctions in the near term, which is good, but at the same time, Croatia has done a remarkably adept job at steering U.S. policy towards its interests. I don't want to go into the weeds again, but we've had this very contentious electoral reform process that Tanya noted with this very, very controversial high representative. Even if Mr. Čović ends up under sanctions in the next few months, the United States unfortunately has helped deliver the most significant retrenchment of sectarianism in Bosnia at the behest of Zagreb since the original signing of Dayton. So all of this is to say, vis-a-vis NATO, Bosnia is already in the membership action program. It is the next step is full membership. Obviously, there are serious issues with realizing Bosnia's eventual NATO membership, but interestingly enough, unlike Bosnia's EU prospects, virtually all of the legislative dimensions at the Bosnian domestic level are ready. They're in law. The creation of the Unified Bosnian Armed Forces actually sorted most of those issues out. So now it's more about the sort of interoperability element of the equation. A really good sort of smell test for American officials who are convinced that Croatia is a good faith actor in the Western Balkans is the question of Bosnia and NATO. Because this is something that, unlike the prospect of EU enlargement by 2030 that Charles Michel has talked about, which nobody believes is actually going to happen, the idea of Bosnia in NATO by 2030, and for instance, Kosovo in the PFP, that's highly doable. It's a lift, but in very much within the realm of the possible. Now, the question of Hungary in that regard is also, hugely problematic. But the sort of the one caveat with Hungary is that Hungary has, and I say this, very much tongue in cheek, Hungary has now become a European problem, right? Unlike Croatia. Croatia is not yet a European problem. They'll get there. Don't you worry. If things keep going the way they're going now, they'll get there. And they've already, it's already become an issue. It's sort of widely known. For instance, I'll kind of make this the last point. It's widely known that when the whole conversation about Sweden and Finland into NATO was going on, you all might have seen the headline about the Croatian president suggesting that Croatia should condition Sweden and Finland's entry into NATO on changes to Bosnia-Herzegovina's electoral law in line with Zagreb's demand. A country that's neither in the EU or NATO. I mean, completely preposterous. Now, the prime minister at the time, Plenković, said, "Oh no, we're not. That's preposterous. We're not going to do that." Privately, it's understood that Plenković had made a very, very similar threat to allies, as Milanovic had made publicly. So all of which is to say is, Hungary is a European problem and it needs to be dealt in multilateral fora. Again, Bosnia and NATO is a smell test there, but ultimately the pressure is really going to have to come down on Croatia.
I was just going
Yeah, go ahead,
to
Tanya.
really
Yeah.
quickly. Hungary is also in the chain of command for U4, which is a real problem for Bosnia, and it affects interoperability and the ability to move and command troops. So they're a malign actor, as Yasmin has laid out, but it's problematic within the U4 chain of command, and that has to be addressed. It's really problematic, and it hinders a really weak force anyway because it doesn't have enough soldiers. And it's lightly armed. It has no heavy armaments. So it could not protect Bosnia by an internal advance or certainly an external one.
Yeah.
You want to comment?
Yeah, exactly. Speaking about Bosnia, Bosnia's accession to NATO, we've been pushing for, for Bosnia to get fast track accession to NATO for quite some time now. I was quite shocked yesterday with a meeting with Gab Escobar. And when he told us quite frankly, he said, this kind of Bosnia with Dodic power, that's something NATO doesn't want to have, right? It makes sense. It makes perfect sense. Why would you want a NATO member state with a pro-Russian proxy who effectively runs it? I mean, he doesn't run the country, but he's able to block it, right? So that's something we can't, have yet. We've been told that, in the younger generation of Bosnian Serb politicians will be much more liberal, open-minded, pro-Western. It turned out to be a completely different, it turned out to be false. The mayor of Banja Luka is a perfect example, Mr. Stanivukovic. He was seen as a breath of fresh air, just like Dodik was 30 years ago. However, as we more closely analyzed his, his rhetoric and his statement and his interviews, if you shut your eyes and you listen to that, it's pretty much the same. It echoes Milorad Dodik's rhetoric when it comes to Bosnia, to Republic of Srpska and Serbian relations, NATO, EU, and it's very Islamophobic lately. I don't expect much from the younger Serbian political elite. And then we saw these young politicians celebrating Alexander Vucic's victory very recently in Belgrade. These were rigged elections, and the reason why Ambassador Christopher Hill gave a very watered down and neutral video statement, that's a different story. So what we are aiming for now is try to get some sort of at least enhanced cooperation with NATO. And Yasmin has also been pushing for a NATO military base, most likely in Brčko, because Brčko is outside of the Dayton Peace Agreement, has a different sort of legal system. That's much more doable. It's otherwise you might have to get the permission of the tripartite presidency, which is a non-starter at the very beginning. When it comes to the EU formation, I spoke to the Norwegian ambassador a couple of months ago in Sarajevo, and we initially had 600 soldiers. It was pumped up to 1,200 when the war in Ukraine started. Some of them have been retreated over the last couple of months. Even the foreign ambassadors in Bosnia and Sarajevo will tell you these U4 troops in Sarajevo have no military experience. They are reservists. They come from different countries, Slovenia, Romania, Albania, you name it. They would not be able to defend their own military base in Butmir, let alone keep the peace in the country. We are kids who grew up during the war. We were refugees as well. I was a refugee. I don't know. He fled to the U.S. I fled to Macedonia, Turkey, Malaysia. We see the same red flags today as we saw back in 1991. As the Yugoslav People's Army was collapsing back in 1991, we see the armed forces of Bosnia, a major success story of the U.S. involvement in the region, on the brink of collapse. On the 9th of January celebrations, a couple of 10 days ago, 15, for the first time, we saw ethnic Serb generals from the armed forces, mostly NATO trained at the George C. Marshall Center and other NATO institutions around Europe, attending these illegal, Dodik celebrations in the Republic of Srpska, along with, Vucic's son, Ratko Mladic's son, the Chinese ambassador, the Russian ambassadors. So we see the creation of parallel structures in the Republic of Srpska, first time in the post-Dayton Bosnia, and of course. Serbs are very pragmatic, when they think, they know what they want. They're pretty, they have their national interest, which supersede all else. And I think they're just waiting for the right geopolitical moments. And Dodik made it very clear. He said, if this year, if Trump wins the elections, it will be a perfect geopolitical moment for us to declare our independence. And this will no longer be Bosnia's problem. This will be, I understand that we're not the country that's we're not the top priority. You have Ukraine with, declining interest for support. You have Taiwan, you have Israel, you have Bab el-Mandeb, the Houthis, you name it, But if something goes really bad in Bosnia neighbors to NATO member states. Every war in the past, the Balkan wars, the 1990s wars, First and Second World War, the 1878 Ottoman Russian wars, they always had a spillover effect. Sooner or later, you'll have an entire region engulfed in flames. It will no longer be. It will be an issue that the Europeans can't deal with. We know that they don't speak with one voice. It all goes back to Henry Kissinger and what's Europe's phone number. We will need American leadership at least to spearhead this process and keep the peace. What we are arguing for, and we've been meeting with the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee over the last couple of days, and the staffers of Senator Murphy, Shaheen, and the rest, they're very much involved in the Balkans. But of course, apparently, the State Department at this moment has, and the White House, they have different priorities. So, that's not much we can do.
I don't hold any hope there.
Yeah.
I just don't. We're going into presidential midterm
Exactly.
elections. Joe Biden's got a lot on his plate. I just don't see the Balkans rising to the level of attention until they have to do something. And if they have to do something, it's going to be too late. That's my biggest concern and fear.
And the flip side of what Tanya is saying there is, and I think this is something that's really poorly understood or not understood at all in the United States, is actually the extent to which Balkan actors have become involved in American domestic politics.
Yeah.
So right now, right now, this has been going on for the better part of the last 4 years. There's been an extremely concerted Serbian lobbying effort.
Yeah.
And I mean that the government of Serbia has spent an inordinate amount of money in this town. Through official and unofficial means. And a lot of what they have done is that they have identified something that a lot of other American adversaries and challengers have identified, which is that unfortunately in this country right now, we have something that we've never had before, which is a bifurcation in the American foreign policy consensus. So, we used to have a core strategic vision as the United States in terms of how we were going to deal with the world that transcended partisan divides between Republicans and Democrats. That is no longer the case. And you have now started seeing foreign actors like Serbia very much investing in that partisan divide. So for Serbia, they have concluded that not so much that the Democratic Party is a write-off, but that there's a lot of baggage with the Democratic Party for Serbia. Now, they've made pretty good strides in sort of modernizing the view of Serbia, but there's still some baggage, especially because this administration has appointed a lot of people to key foreign policy positions who were actually active in the 90s or immediately thereafter. So Chris Hill, Ambassador Murphy in Sarajevo, a lot of old hands, as it were. But what Serbia is doing very specifically is basically trying to massage the shape of the future direction of a Republican administration. I think they very clearly identified a number of names that they would like to see in senior positions. I don't think it's any secret, for instance, that Serbia would very much like to see Richard Grenell as the next Secretary of State. That is, that is a national security issue for the United States. That a foreign government is attempting to steer appointments within future American administrations. Now, I'm not making any allegations about Mr. Grenell, but it is very obvious what's happening. It's playing out publicly, right? So when you are traveling to Belgrade and you are getting state honors from a man who is a close associate of Vladimir Putin, who's a close associate of Xi Jinping, and you are very much seriously in the conversation to be a very senior American official in the next administration, as you were in the previous one, that should raise some red flags.
But we should give credit to Serbia for what it does in DC and in Western Europe. I really admire the way Croatia manages to lobby EU members of the parliament to, to push for their case. I mean, wherever you go, if you go to Brussels, you want to talk about environmental security or whatever, they say, yeah, but you should reform your electoral laws to make sure the Croats are properly represented. And the thing about us Bosnians is that it boils down to a number of individuals such as you, Tanya, myself, and now Azim, who's interested, he's paying a lot of attention to the Western Balkans. There's no concerted state effort to be present in DC to make your case for Bosnia. In the mindset of the average Bosnian politicians, and I've been being there quite often lately, they think that in DC you still have Bill Clinton, Madeleine Albright, McCloskey calling the shots. I mean, 30. These people are either dead or they are dying or they are irrelevant. I mean, 30 years have passed since any sort of friendship. If you don't see your friends or allies for 30 years, you can't even consider them friends or allies anymore. The U.S. back then in you had the end of the Cold War. You had America coming out as a winner. You had a very weak Russia. And it took nearly 3.5-4 years for the US to put an end to the genocide in Bosnia. Now with all these different distractions around the world, I don't expect much. So it drops down to us as individuals to make the case for Bosnia. Only recently did we see Mr. Konakovic come in and meet with certain senators in DC. Before that, I don't recall when was the last time a member of the presidency came officially to DC to meet up with anybody.
I just want to say about this issue about the lobbying inside the Beltway by the Croats and by the Serbs is that SDA and the people affiliated had missed their mark in a major way. It's a strategic fault that lays at their feet because they have been outfoxed and outmanned left and right. And just as you said, Haroon, all of us here and many of our friends are the people that are doing the lobbying on behalf of a democratic Bosnia. Absolutely. And that really tells you how the money has moved their message, and their messages have had reception and agreement. And I also want to add, with respect to, in general, all these people that we've mentioned, they've been dead. Many of them have been dead for a while, and most members of Congress now, especially in the House, and very few of the senators have any memory of the Balkan Wars. And as Yasmin pointed out, it was Pax Americana in '95 when the Dayton Accords were signed. And remember what happens on 9/11, and that's when everything left the region. And I told my friends in Sarajevo, I said, this is a warning. They are leaving and they are moving everything into Afghanistan and Iraq at that point. And that was the major step back. And Barack Obama actually advanced that when Lady Ashton started the dialogue on Serbia, Kosovo, and he said, I need your backing for the Iran agreement, and we were just pulled out. And as a matter of fact, on the first day of George W. Bush's administration, he shut the Dayton office down. So I just want people to understand where that shift began, and this is where we are today.
I will say one positive thing that has happened, and both of these points are absolutely well taken, and they're very much in conversation with each other. I think one of the good things that's happened, I would say, over the last 2 or 3 years, and it's largely out of necessity, but was it mother of invention? I've started seeing an unprecedented degree of conversation, both in the region and within our global diaspora, between folks from Bosnia, folks from Kosovo, and folks from Montenegro. And I think this is one of the most constructive things that's happening in the region right now. For instance, Kosovo right now is going to hopefully procure the $72 million acquisition of javelins. This is one of the most positive things that's happened in the region in a very long time. A strong, stable, sovereign Kosovo, that it has a credible internal deterrent. Right, not a deterrent that is KFOR, a deterrent that is the Kosovo security force. is very positive for the whole of the Western Balkans. And so I've been encouraging, every time I've had an opportunity to speak with, leaders in Sarajevo, leaders in Podgorica, leaders in Pristina, please talk to each other, formally and informally. And I understand, especially vis-a-vis Bosnia and Kosovo, there's an issue because formally Bosnia doesn't recognize Kosovo's sovereignty, and we should be very ashamed of that. But there's a reason for that, unfortunately, because of our good friends in Banja Luka. But it is what it is. That doesn't mean we can't pursue track 2 diplomacy.
Yeah.
So, things like what Harun and Hikmet and their crew is doing with the Sarajevo Security Conference. There's similar conferences in places like Budva. These are opportunities for Kosovo officials, Kosovo civil society, Bosnian civil society, Bosnian officials, etc. We need to be having these conversations because at the end of the day, unfortunately, as we learned in the 90s and as we've had to continue relearning, what starts in Kosovo ends in Bosnia, what starts in Bosnia ends in Montenegro and Kosovo. We're interconnected. So when Aleksandar Vulin or Aleksandar Vučić speaks of the Serbian world, it can't just be our friends in Pristina saying, whoa, it has to be all of us because it is a threat to all of us. I mean, I said this in Sarajevo and I'll say it again here. My parents' generation, God bless them, I love them, but made a massive error because in 1981, when Albanian students in Kosovo were being brutalized by the Yugoslav security services, that should have been a wake-up call to people in Bosnia and Croatia and Slovenia as to the direction of that country then. And so for the same reason, when I see violence in Banjska, or I see Serb nationalists, militants beating up KFOR soldiers, and KFOR is struggling to come up with a response, I panic about what that means for EUFOR. I panic about what that means for Bosnia, what it means for Montenegro. So,
when Ukraine invaded, when Russia invaded Ukraine,
he's jet lagged. He's jet lagged.
I was quite surprised to see to what extent the average Bosnian was able to associate himself with the plight of Ukrainians. I work at Al Jazeera and received quite a number of phone calls from concerned citizens of Sarajevo asking us what was the state of Sarajevo's underground shelters and bunkers, And I said, why? He said, what if, in case a war breaks out? And this was quite surprising to me, when the war in Syria broke out and the revolution which morphed into a war, or, what happened in Yemen or Iraq, Afghanistan, nobody was really able to express, associate themselves with the plight of those people. But in the case of Ukraine, they really were, Bosnians saw, the bombing of Kiev was very reminiscent of the bombing of Sarajevo, And I live in a suburb of Sarajevo, and when I went to my local supermarket, people were stacking up on on essentials like cooking oil, sugar, and flour. That was right after those January 9th celebrations, when probably the peak of all the paranoia that we have in our country, and people are really afraid. I mean, I myself went to the bank and I withdrew all my cash reserves, foreign cash reserves. I won't tell you how much I have, but things can get really bad overnight in the country. And yesterday we were speaking to our friends at the USIP, and they asked me, well, if you're so concerned, I mean, can you give us one example of some sort of violence or violent, incident that happened in your country? I said, we don't have to wait for this to happen. The reason we want to preemptively react to make sure it doesn't happen. I mean, you had in 2018 the attempted military coup in Montenegro, where 2 GRU officials were indicted by the country's state prosecutor. You had the Banjska incident, which could have been, God forbid, far worse. 100 people, people, wearing military-grade uniforms, having military-grade weapons. Thank God that the Kosovars had their Bayraktar TB2 drones and they were able to identify them on time. This could have been far, far bloodier. Milan Radojic, the head of that gang, was arrested and set free less than 24 hours later by the Serbian regime. There is not a snowball's chance in hell that Vučić could not have known about this incident. And so in Bosnia, the average Bosnian citizen is heavily armed. All it takes is an attack on a Bosniak Muslim returnee in Srebrenica, or God forbid, if somebody gets killed in that part of the Republika Srpska, which will react in a copycat attack in Sarajevo or elsewhere, followed by one more attack in the Republika Srpska, and then all hell will break loose.
I also think the Ukraine war really triggered an incredible trauma, PTSD within the Bosnian population. And my friend Anita Cherkes, a war correspondent, actually wrote a letter to the people of Ukraine that was picked up by the BBC. It was very moving. Christian Amanpour invited her on to read it. And she said to me, you're talking about pulling money out of the bank. She said, Tanya, what you need is a gun. You need ammo. You need all the cash you can have on hand. And, you know, we have many people do have second homes, fortunately, thanks to Tito and the, you know, SFRY legacy. So lots of people do have second homes, and how to situate yourself for the possibility of war. And I heard this, as you said, from countless Bosnian friends about what that war in Ukraine, how it affected the psychological state of Bosnians.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, you know, the contrast between the response in Ukraine and the response that was happened in Bosnia. You know, you had a situation in Ukraine in which a country, you know, that was part of a larger polity, the Soviet Union, broke off, and then the larger country invaded the smaller one, trying to usurp this territory. Essentially exactly what happened in Bosnia. And the response in Bosnia was a polar opposite. Now, I understand in Ukraine, there was obviously a fear that after Ukraine, it would be, you know, Moldova, then no response, and possibly Poland, etc. It's just geopolitics. But in terms of a credibility standpoint, the West response in Bosnia was just absolutely abysmal. But I want to move the conversation on. There's obviously a lot of discussion now since the war in Ukraine about foreign interference in the Balkans, and this is something that's kind of now emerging and becoming much more clearer. So I want to start off with you, Yasmin, in terms of foreign. What are the major actors that are involved in this influence? What are they trying to achieve? What is their kind of end game, and how successful have they been?
So I think you have essentially three varieties of malign foreign interference in the Western Balkans. One is represented by Russia. Russia sees in the Western Balkans a cheap place to do business, meaning a cheap place to cause brush fires for the West that will then distract Western officials from you know, where Russia's immediate security and strategic interests are, in particular Ukraine. So anything you can do to essentially divide Western attention is good, and the Western Balkans are an easy way to do that. So, you know, the Russians have this major intelligence station down in the city of Niš, which is a stone's throw from the Kosovo border. They officially call it a humanitarian center. But you know, it's transparent as to what's going on. We know from the events in what is now North Macedonia, those of you who might recall a few years ago where there was a very violent sacking of the North Macedonian parliament, very much sort of foreshadowing, unfortunately, things that happened in this country. We know from the documents that were then made public by OCCRP after the change in government in Skopje that Russian and Serbian intelligence operatives work very closely together in the region, and they share a core strategic interest, which is general destabilization, but also preventing NATO enlargement. Right? Then you have China. China has very much identified the Western Balkans as an emerging sort of strategic market. It has invested by local standards very heavily. By Chinese standards, no, but by local standards, very heavily. You know, this major highway project in Montenegro that is raising fears of a debt trap. In Bosnia, China, at least on paper, has sort of slated the single largest post-war investment in Bosnian history, which is the expansion of the so-called Block 7 coal power plant in the city of Tuzla. And even, for instance, in Croatia, which is an EU and NATO member state, when Croatia built this, what they call, Panelist, this strategically important bridge. Yes. So it's incredible. Croatia gets money from the EBRD, and they give the money to a Chinese construction firm in order to build this strategic project. And obviously, you know, China isn't investing in the infrastructure of the Western Balkans because, you know, the Balkans are particularly salient to the whole Belt and Road Initiative. But instead, it's very clear that
they're trying to create dependency structures that they can then operationalize in terms of China's actual international interests, in particular vis-a-vis ongoing international disputes vis-a-vis the South China Sea, Taiwan, et cetera, et cetera. So if you can kind of accumulate these small states that will vote with you in relevant institutions, there you go.
And the Uyghurs as well.
Exactly. And then the third and last variety of malign foreign interference is the one that's actually most acute and most destructive. And that is the sort of imminent regional malign influence. So this is the one that animates politics in the region on a day-to-day basis. When you're talking about Bosnia, these are obviously Croatia and Serbia first and foremost, but also, as I've noted, increasingly, unfortunately, also Hungary. Though Hungary is closer to Serbia, but they very much coordinate also with the Croatians, and obviously the Croatians coordinate with Serbia. I mean, that's the other sort of dirty little secret in all of this, right? As the old joke from the 90s goes, Croatia and Serbia had a war and Bosnia lost. So you have Serbia and Croatia and Hungary vis-a-vis Bosnia. In the case of Kosovo, most obviously Serbia vis-a-vis Russia as well, but then also obviously in Montenegro, Serbia. And Montenegro, unfortunately, doesn't get a lot of attention at all, even though they should, because, I mean, granted, they're a very small state, but they are a NATO member state. And I was just in Montenegro in October, right around the time of the Sarajevo Security Conference, and I've said to a number of people here, you know, notwithstanding the severity of the situation, both in Bosnia and Kosovo, the level of political polarization in Montenegro right now, to my mind, is unprecedented. The way people are talking about politics in that country, to me, is very alarming. And the idea that the sort of Montenegrin sovereigntist camp, who I am very sympathetic to, I think they've made a very convincing argument for the fact that Montenegro is in a kind of virtual occupation by Serbia and also Russia, because there's a massive Russian diaspora that is presently located in Montenegro, a large portion of whom are obviously intelligence operatives. You have a government that is basically, you know, been, as folks in Montenegro are wont to say, you know, was agreed to in a Serb Orthodox church, which is to say a Serbian embassy. So, you know, this is a very, very ugly situation. But again, unfortunately, in places like DC, there is some concern with Russia and China. We see that because we understand that through our own prisons. There is very little, I think, understanding and sensitivity for the thing that actually alarms and animates politics in the region, and that is that sort of, shall we say, regional malign influence, i.e. Serbia, Croatia, Hungary.
And I would add on Montenegro, what a reversal in terms of the polarization. I actually worked in Montenegro in 2003 to 2004 as an advisor in the office of the Prime Minister. And I was amazed by the identification of people as Montenegrins, not Albanian. I'm Montenegrin, not Serb. I'm Montenegrin. Yeah. And I was really, having been in Bosnia from 96 to 2000, what a contrast it was. And it was refreshing, and it was a moment too of possibility and optimism, and it has been completely reversed in a very dangerous way. And the instrumentalization of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Serbian Orthodox Church into their politics is very alarming, and also what it's doing to other minorities, Bosniaks, LGBT people, I mean, women. It's terrible what is happening in Montenegro.
You know, Azim, I mean, when you talk about foreign malign influences in Bosnia, I mean, the first thing that comes to the mind of, you know, of the average Western observer is, you know, Islamic countries that were very much active in the post-war country. I mean, I wrote both my MA and my PhD thesis on the role played by Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. This was a period of very visible, you know, public expressions of Islam, of course, for many, at least 10 to 15 years after the end of the war. And you know, we were of course, there was generally a revival of Islam and religion in most post-communist countries. It was the case in Poland, in Bulgaria, in Serbia, you name it. But then with the beginning of the war in Syria, and you know how the anti-Assad revolution slowly morphed into a civil war with various radical elements, and the appearance of ISIS and or Daesh and Al Qaeda. Quite a number of, it was a very small number, but they gained a lot of attention. A number of Balkan Muslims, decided to join these militant groups and made their way towards Iraq and Syria. Their presence, I think, nobody has the exact numbers, but between 150 to 200. They received, exaggerated amount of attention in global media. So much so that you had BBC documentaries, France 24, DW, ARD doing documentaries about how Bosnia was the hotbed of Islamic radicalism and so on and so forth. And then, very wolfishly, Serbian and Croatian nationalists decided to play on those existing fears of an existing Islamophobia among West Europeans, and say, hey, we were right in fighting those Muslims back in 1992. They tried to retroactively justify the genocide against Bosnians by depicting Bosnians, all Bosnians as Islamic radicals. And then that also played along with rising the far right sentiment in Europe, rising Islamophobia. And what worries me most is that if you look back at the 1990s and how the Post, New York Times, Time magazine covered the war in Bosnia, Bosnian Muslims had the image of those secular, pro-Western, multicultural good guys, right? Serbs were bad. Things have changed drastically over the last 15 years. There's no longer Western support for Bosnian Muslims. Croatian lobbying has had its effects. Serbian lobbying has had its effects. We are now viewed at best as being equally bad, equally responsible for war and being equally bad. So that's something that worries me. The generation of journalists that covered the war in Bosnia, Ed Gloomy, Christine Amanpour, Penny Marshall, Aida Cherkez, these people, they were in Bosnia during the war. They know the situation very well. Now you have journalists from the Times who will come spend 2 days in Bosnia and write an article about.
They know nothing.
They know nothing.
They're helicoptering in. It's very dangerous.
And the irony of the situation is that if you look at the far right movement, even the violent far right movement in Europe, United States, around the world, they actually trace their origins to actually Serbia. Yeah. And Dr. Hikmet Karkic and I did an essay on this on foreign policy a few years back, and there's actually a direct line that can be traced back to many of the fighters that came from all over Europe, that came to fight in Serbia on behalf of the Serbs, and went back to their countries and founded these extreme right-wing movements. And that has basically laid the foundation for the far right.
Hikmet also wrote an essay in our September monograph, and I would add that not only has that really turned in the publications, as you indicated. Ralph Bajrović and I wrote a piece on Israel and how Dodik and Chovic went to Jerusalem without question. And this was during a technical government in Israel. It's before the Netanyahu government came to power. And they pulled them in to meddle in Bosnia's electoral law situation, which was quite controversial at the time. And secondly, Mr. Dodik himself pulled in right-wing Israelis in his fake commission to try to denigrate the concept of genocide. It did not happen in Srebrenica. And this was a horrible thing that was debunked by our friend Menachem Rosensaft, and he took them on. But this is just an example, and Hikmet, you really laid it out. But also, I've had Dr. Rosensaft to Columbia a couple of times talking about these issues.
Yeah, and it's interesting how they try to negate the genocide in Bosnia. They don't. It's quite sophisticated. They don't deny it outright. That this didn't happen. They say, "Oh yes, it happened, but it was a rogue police chief that basically operated on his own. He killed a few people, he put them in a mass grave, but there was never any, command and control structure from the leadership. And so obviously there's mass graves there, people know that they're there, and they say, well, yeah, but this was not our policy, this was just a rogue element.
Just very quickly on that, and vis-a-vis the writing and research that Hickman in particular has done on this, I want to cast your memory back to the very horrific terrorist attack in Christchurch.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
So
Yes.
the assailant there was completely consumed with Serb nationalist motifs. I mean, they were written on his rifle, they were written on the bullets. He is live streaming himself going to the Islamic Center in the mosque to kill 50 plus people, and he is live streaming and he is playing and singing a Serb nationalist song from the Bosnian War, Karadžićevo Vojsko Sebe, better known in sort of online meme culture as the quote unquote remove kebab song. That term and that slur specifically refers to the Bosnian genocide, kebab being a slur for Bosniaks, aka Bosnian Muslims. And the idea of being as he called himself, a so-called kebab removalist, is this idea that, I mean, you should be committing mass atrocities, right? But I think what's really interesting about the way that the global far right has adopted the Bosnian genocide is that they're hearkening back to sort of the 1992-1993 era of Serb nationalism, where the line was not, we're not committing these atrocities, we're not executing mass people. It's not that there aren't concentration camps or rape camps or all the expulsions no, it's all happening. And we're doing it for you, Europe. Because we are the guardians of Christendom.
Absolutely. And I have a footnote on the Christchurch situation, because I was live streaming it on Facebook. At that time, Una Hadari, a well-known, highly regarded reporter, was interning at the time at the New York Times on a special fellowship. And she knew the song, and she identified it to the editors on the desk, and they refused to include it. She has talked to me about that, and that tells you exactly what is on the desk now. These are editors that have no history and no knowledge of what's going on in the ground.
So just wrapping up, because I'm conscious of everybody's time here. It seems that the international institutions, the European Union and others, when they were set up, they were obviously never designed, they never took into consideration to have the likes of Orban and others to kind of, play the role that they're actually playing. And they don't seem to have any response, and even actual ability within the institution to actually cater to that. This is incidentally something I describe in my book, which you can see there, Authoritarian Century, what I term as multilateral autocratization. International institutions that will essentially become autocratic because they were never set up to that. The book is available online and in all good bookshops, I should say. But if you're obviously here in Washington, if you were to meet with Secretary Blinken for a short time and you had to make some recommendations to him, what would you say to him that is realistic and that he can actually do right now? I'll start off as you wish.
Oh, that's really a tough one.
Something that's realistic, so not you send 2 divisions there. Or whatever.
I mean, what's interesting, and Yasmin pointed out that a lot of old hands have been brought back into the State Department, but that hasn't indicated a change. That actually is indicated a change in the wrong direction, and that we have to reinvent and create a new strategic approach to the region that takes in mind what is happening on its borders and more writ large, the entire world. As you pointed out, on the rise of autocracies and how now it's controlling all these international institutions. And so there's got to be a reimagining of US foreign policy, because the UK wants to partner with us, they follow us. They don't initiate, they follow us. And the EU has been so weak that if the US can lead, I think others will follow. But right now, I see the US has forsaken its leadership role and it needs to reimagine it now.
So what I would say is, I mean, I could get into hyper detailed policy recommendations that I'm not going to do. Here's what I would say, in terms of something that I think is conceptually digestible. If we can't deal with the likes of Milan Dodic, we, the United States, we got no chance against the Xis and Putins of the world. Right? So unless we are able to demonstrate our commitment and credibility in a country in which we literally wrote the Constitution, like the guy who wrote the document is in the State Department right now.
Yeah.
I'm not going to name him, but everyone knows who he is. He's a great guy. So we could go talk to the framer. So if we can't deliver on Bosnia, and delivering on Bosnia, for instance, in this context right now, doesn't just mean, confront Dodik, but like we had this landmark ruling by the ECHR, the Kovacevic ruling, which really spelled out exactly where Bosnia needs to go in terms of constitutional reform. If the United States can't say, yep, we're going to run with what the European Convention of Human Rights said, which is already embedded in the Bosnian Constitution, we're going to fulfill our generational promise. We're going to deliver on that historic apex prize of American diplomacy from the halcyon days of the 1990s. Our good friends in Kyiv don't have a chance. And I've been trying to explain this to friends here and in Europe. And I've tried to explain this, unfortunately, also to our friends in Ukraine, because my heart breaks for them, not just because of the violence that is being committed against them in their country, but because I am so afraid that the Europeans in particular are lying through their teeth to Ukraine. Ukraine is not going to join the EU. It is not going to join the EU. Do not tell them that they will do that if you can't even deliver Tauruses to them. If North Korea is able to outproduce the whole of the European Union in munitions, what are we talking about? So there you go.
That's a very good point, that you can't expect to deal with the likes of Putin and Xi if you can't deal with his fanboys, essentially the minions. And if you're not going to take that seriously, then a lot of the stuff is pure fantasy.
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, exactly. 2 days ago in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a lady who works there, when I pitched the idea that we should increase the number of US troops in Bosnia, she said, we have to make sure we get Dodik's approval. We have to make sure it's in line with Bosnia's laws. And I was shocked. I said, hey, the greatest superpower, are you telling me that the greatest superpower the world has ever seen needs the approval of a rogue element such as Dodik to increase its troop numbers?
Also, sorry to cut you off. It's not true. The
Not
existing
true.
NATO
Of course
mandate is
not
there.
true.
So.
Exactly. Then we have zero chance against Xi Jinping or Putin, and we see slowly, US support for Ukraine declining. They've been doing really a good PR job ever since the war began, but we see support declining. Once US refocuses itself on the southern border, Ukraine has zero chances of winning. Once that happens, the Baltics are next, Poland is next, Moldova is next, and we in the Balkans are next,
So on that sobering thought, I want to wrap it up, and I want to give sincere thanks to our speakers. Before you leave, do have a look at our essays on the Western Balkans, the first tranche of Balkans essays led by Professor Tanya Domi here. We do have another tranche coming out soon on the political and security situation in the Balkans. that will be coming out later this spring. And look out also for the Western Balkans Observatory, which we're setting up. My colleague here, Yasmin, is also working on a project on Dayton as well, putting together a task force to look at Dayton and how that can and how we can work on that as well. So do look out for that, and please do give our speakers who have come a long way a round of applause for this very.